Now, another thing that you just mentioned is choosing the artists for this, because unlike many comics, you vary the artists wildly with the story arc. What really are you trying to do with that?
I suppose I'm trying to work to different people's strengths and get... Sometimes I'll have an artist there or know that I can have an artist if I want one, and I'll look at what they do and try and come up with a story for their strengths. And occasionally, as in the case of the longer story arcs, I will have an idea of the kind of feel the story has in my head, and see if we can find an artist whose work matches that feel. So it's a bit of both, but it's to create the best possible telling of that story.
I think that works very well with what you're doing, because it is a problem with some comics that, of course, there is the compromise in the art style, where you have an artist who's just not suited to an individual story, and they have to do it anyway because they're the regular artist. And that's a problem that I can see arising.
I went through that a little, I think, on the very first issues of Sandman, forcing poor old Sam Keith, who has since become very famous and very popular, to draw stories he really didn't want to at the time, because they were the stories, and it took a few issues until I was tailoring stuff for him. But after a while, we did start tailoring stuff for him, and I think it worked a lot better. And I was still learning. I like the difference in Season of Mists between the Kelly Jones work and what you get in Game of You with Sean McManus. Two very, very different artists with very different styles. And each is completely appropriate for that storyline. Kelly wouldn't have worked anywhere near as well on Game of You. Sean couldn't have pulled off the grandeur, I think, of Season of Mists.
I think that may be true. We were commenting earlier on the design on the Game of You. Who did this cover on the actual book?
Dave McKean does the whole thing. Dave McKean, who's the cover artist on Sandman, and my oldest collaborator. Well, not in age, actually. He's probably one of the youngest in age, but we've been working together since 1986. Designs the books and has done a beautiful job. I mean, he's done the cover on the book. He's done the hidden cover underneath the cover with this gorgeous leather and this purpley silver embossing. And then you get inside, and he's done all these strange design pages for the book, for the Samuel Delaney introduction. We're very proud and honored to have Chip doing the introduction. And he's actually gone in and made it very beautiful. Made it something that would be nice to have.
It's sort of difficult to think in terms of a coffee table comic book, but in a way this is.
Oh, sure. But I think that's important. I think it's important that it looks like something that deserves to be taken seriously. I think it's important that it looks good. I think it's important that if you woke up in the night and discovered that you were being burgled, you could pick that up and hit somebody with it and do serious damage, which is one of my criteria for great art. Will it do serious damage? No, it's a serious book. An adult would not be embarrassed to be seen reading that on a subway. And I think that's important, just for the legitimacy of the medium of comics.
That's true. I have to admit that I was reading the Season of Mists on a bus, so it makes perfect sense. Now, what you're trying to do with the Sandman seems to be a very different kind of storytelling from what people are really familiar with in traditional comics. Maybe if you want to describe a little bit of what you're doing for the listeners, my personal impression is that the Sandman is to traditional comics in some ways what The Prisoner was to the traditional television of the 1960s. And by that I mean you're taking the basic concepts and distorting them slightly and creating a world where everything seems just a little bit twisted from the norm. And that includes the very context and the very givens of a comic book world. In The Season of Mists, for example, you have several different ongoing things from the regular DC universe happening in passing through the eyes of the gods. The old 1940s heroes and having their ongoing battle in supposed Ragnarok, and you find out that from Odin's viewpoint, this was just something he'd put aside, and he'd set up sort of a phony Ragnarok that they were fighting. Or the comments involving the different DC characters from the horror comics as they wander through being characters in this sort of a structure. There's something rather surreal about that, but at the same time, it doesn't throw away the comic book universe as much as it just looks at it from a totally different direction.
Well, partly, I think it's written for people who are completely unfamiliar, and perhaps rightly so, with any kind of comic book universe or continuity. You don't have to have read any comic books to understand it. There are people who will read A Game of You and not realize that some weird characters in one of the characters' dreams are based on the Bizarros, old characters now forgotten from 1960s Superman comics. Some people may recognize that and get an additional kick out of it. Yes, I think you're right. Sandman is about storytelling. It doesn't set out to deconstruct normal comics. It simply goes off and does what it does. In some ways, I suppose, it's automatically placed itself beyond the pale of normal comics, in that it's simply in that it has an end. One of the givens of comics, ever since 1939, when Superman and Batman got their own titles, is that a successful character will be out there forever. If you have a character that is successful, you do it. If the creator gets bored or asks for more money, you fire him and you get some new people on board. Nobody's ever going to know or care who draws Batman or who writes it, or Superman or Spider-Man, or, these things go on for years and years and years and years and years. And they don't have ends. There is no ending planned. Sandman is something that's going to finish. There is a story that began in Sandman 1. When it comes to an end, it stops. It's now essentially DC's third best-selling title. And according to the traditional givens of comic books, it would be insane for them to stop it when I leave, and they're going to. So from that perspective, it's already changed the rules. It's very strange. We get acclaim and applause from sources that are, very surprising, very well respected. The strangest people read Sandman.
Well, I've noticed you have the dedications from Harlan Ellison and Samuel Delaney and that sort of people. So I can see that. I can only think of one other comic that had a plan to end, and in fact it's, halfway through, the Cerebus by Dave Sim, which did a marvelous parody of the Sandman just recently.
Oh, it is a terrifying and strange thing being parodied by somebody who is really, really good. Partly because you're falling about laughing, and partly because your toes are curling and you're going, do I really do that? Oh dear. And although what was kind of fun was seeing Dave's parody of Sandman. And I'd done a lot of stuff with the Sandman wandering around being all self-pitying. And Dave took this one step further, and he had this character he called Swoon, who was about as maudlin and self-pitying as it was possible to be. And that got me to thinking about different ways of doing that and how to avoid doing that, seeing that I was being parodied. And I wound up finishing Brief Lives, the last storyline, with a sequence that is incredibly sad, because what actually happens is there, a major tragedy strikes, and instead of going around being all self-pitying, the Sandman wanders around being horribly cheerful and being terribly nice to people, and it's heartbreaking. You start wanting him to go out onto a balcony and make it rain for 3 weeks or something.
Well, one of the things I liked about the parody was him having his parody of Elric dress up in drag as your series' Death. And it was one of the most remarkably mind-blowing combinations of demented parody I have ever seen. But I think that worked because what you have is so well structured. And it's so easy to visualize your characters that a solid parody of it like that could work.
I think so, yes. I mean, there's a level on which I suppose you know you've made it when you're being parodied. But what was so lovely with the Cerebus stuff is, you know, you've really made it when you're being parodied well. Incidentally, I hear from Dave that the next subject of parody may well be Flaxen the Golden Girl.
Uh-oh.
And I worry that he's going to be turning Swoon into Flaxen.
Now that's a very scary concept. Either that or turning his Elric parody into Flaxen, which is even scarier.
Much scarier.